Welcome to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. As Syria goes, so does Lebanon. With the violent crisis in Syria continuing to deepen and spread, can Lebanon remain on the sidelines much longer? And many other questions abound. Is Syria intentionally destabilizing Lebanon? And are there elements in Lebanon being used to force regime change in Damascus? To crosstalk the wave of violence across Lebanon, I'm joined by Robert Fisk in Beirut. He is the Middle East correspondent for The Independent. In Pittsburgh, we have Typhoon Gol. He is a member of the Answer Coalition. And in Washington, we cross to Morav Jouijadi. He is a professor of Middle East Studies at the National Defense University. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Robert, if I can go to you first in Beirut, there seems to be two countervailing narratives going on right now. Is that the Syrian Free Army is in Lebanon causing trouble, looking for allies to topple Assad. Or, if you like the other one, you have Assad and his people influencing domestic politics again in Lebanon. Which one do you like, or neither, or a combination?
I don't think it was by chance that Assad made his speech in the Syrian parliament at almost exactly the same time that the violence restarted in Tripoli with 15 dead and 50 wounded. That's almost too much of a coincidence. But I don't believe the line that's being taken by many people here, particularly in the political opposition, that there are hundreds of Syrian fighters among the Alawi community in Tripoli, or that there are hundreds of opposition fighters fighting the Alawis. When I've gone up to Tripoli, and I do it regularly and have done for the past year on this story, although there are many people in Tripoli who are Syrian citizens, their families are intermingled, there are no Syrian forces which I've ever seen up there, nor, for that matter, foreign forces in Tripoli. I think they are Lebanese fighting Lebanese. But is it dangerous? Yes. Is Syria's problem spilling over? It already has.
Okay, Typhoon, can you want to answer the same question? Do you agree or disagree with Robert on that?
Well, I neither agree or disagree. I mean, we have to keep in mind that in Lebanon, there's a situation that there are two essential counterposed sources of authority. One represented by the March 14 coalition, which is basically supported by most of the Western governments, including the U.S., Israel, and then also the client states, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Jordan. And then on the other hand, there is the March 8 alliance, which is essentially led by the Free Patriotic Movement, the Christian group, and the Hezbollah, which has been very important in resisting the Israeli aggression since 1982. So it would be a little simplistic to just simplify the whole Lebanese conflict into a spillover from the Syrian
if I go to Washington,
Lebanese...
I would agree with you, but I think that's what media does, is simplifying, and that's why I'm asking you, gentlemen, to make it more complex for my viewer to understand. If I go to you in Washington, how would you look at it? I mean, who's at fault, I guess, essentially, is what I'm asking.
I think it is Bashar al-Assad and his regime, and he is intentionally trying to spill over the conflict in Syria into Lebanon in order to scare the international community and to deter the international community from contributing to the toppling of his regime. I agree with Robert that it is Lebanese fighting Lebanese, but these are proxy Lebanese, and so you do have those who are allies to the Syrian regime who are doing the fighting against those who are for the Syrian revolution. So again, I think the hand behind the conflict in Lebanon and the spillover in Lebanon is the Bashar al-Assad regime.
All right, gentlemen, before we continue, let's have a look at some of the background to this story.
Sectarian tensions between supporters and opponents of the Syrian government reignited street fighting in the Lebanese city of Tripoli on Saturday. At least 15 people were killed and 30 wounded as activists reported fresh shelling in central Syria, where a massacre last week left more than 100 people dead.
Situation in Lebanon could escalate to open war, especially in Tripoli and the surrounding area, and a lot of people warn about this. about this, because this is a continuation of what is taking place in Syria.
The fighting in Tripoli has erupted sporadically since the uprising in Syria began 15 months ago, prompting all Lebanese political factions to adopt a policy of disassociation from the uprising. Lebanon and Syria share a complex web of political and sectarian ties and rivalries, which are easily inflamed. Community leaders in Lebanon have repeatedly warned the violence in Syria could spill over the border. Lebanon is already hosting thousands of Syrian refugees.
Lebanese are getting nervous. They don't want to have to live through another civil war, and especially because, this is not their conflict. They may have their own thoughts about the Syrian government, but they understand that this is for the Syrian people to decide, and they want security.
Damascus has a long history of intervention in Lebanon and has made no secret of its hope to make its weaker neighbor part of Syria. Since the creation of contemporary Lebanon in 1920, most Syrians have never accepted it as a sovereign state. It is yet to be seen whether Syria's bloody scenario is to be repeated in Lebanon, but the number of casualties and the never-ending clashes seem to be a gloomy prophecy for the country. Anna Yudina for Crosstalk, Moscow.
Okay, Robert, if I can go back to you in Beirut, I mean, in light of the report and what you've said already in this program, is that, you can see a Syrian hand in Lebanese politics, but, Lebanese politics is very fragile at best, okay? It doesn't
Syrian hand.
Yeah, okay, but at the same time, it shows the fragility of the political system in Lebanon. So, I mean, no matter what happens in its neighborhood, it's going to be impacted.
Look, I think you've got to realize in your report, it was mentioned that Lebanon was created in 1920. What it might also have said, it was created by the French in 1920 by being cut out of Syria. It was a Syrian Mahafazat governorate of which Lebanon was taken away. That's why, for example, you have so many people in Tripoli who have relatives in Homs, because 100 years ago they were the same families. That's why when people say, oh, there are Syrians in Tripoli, of course there are. They also have Lebanese passports, because before the French came and chopped up the Middle East, which we British also did quite a lot of, this was one area, and people in Tripoli would go to Homs to go shopping. And there's many politicians in Tripoli, including Sunni Muslim politicians opposed to Assad, who have relatives in Syria. This is the complex bit that you have to realize before you say what's going on in Tripoli.
Okay, I suggest to all my viewers to read Robert's books, as I've read every single one of them. Typhoon, if I can go to you in Pittsburgh, I mean, it's really a sectarian difference here that's going on here. I mean, you can look at Lebanon, you can look at Syria, but it's really the different sects that are involved in here. And just as what Robert has said, the partition of 1920 has never resolved these issues.
I mean, I think we have to talk about the political representation system in Lebanon to get a better understanding of the source of the conflict too. As Robert alluded to, the French colonizers in 1920 and then later in the 1940s, we have to talk about the confessional system, which portions the political representation in Lebanon based on the 18 different religious sects. And even though, say, the Muslim population, which comprises about 70% of the overall Lebanese society, it's only in the recent developments that only half and half representation has been assigned. And then within that 70%, or in the Muslim population itself, the Shiites comprise about 35 to 40% of the overall population. I think we have to realize that there is an underlying political context to this whole conflict that is not necessarily just in the sectarian conflict. It is, in a sense, resistance against the imperialist objectives in the region. It is essentially a conflict of forces on the one side, supported by U.S. imperialism and the client states, represented by the March 14 coalition, and on the other side, it's March 8 alliance. And if we were to look at the popular support, not just based on this confessional system, we would realize that a majority of the Lebanese population is behind the March 8 alliance.
Muraf, if I can go to you, how much of it, I mean, because there's plenty of reports, and I'd like to see a lot more confirmation, that there are foreign fighters in northern Lebanon using northern Lebanon as a safe haven to go into Syria. It's a very porous border.
It's a very porous border. I agree with Robert that it is a complex situation. But let us not exaggerate the complexities. What is basically happened, and to make things easier for the audience who is not very well acquainted with this conflict, what it is a national uprising in Syria against an authoritarian regime which has been in place in 48 years. And Bashar al-Assad is of the view that Syria is his family farm. And in order to hang on to the family farm, he is using scare tactics. One of the scare tactics is to lead the international community to believe that there will be civil war next door if his regime is going to fall.
Can you answer I'm sorry, but can you answer my question? Is northern Lebanon being used as a staging ground to destabilize Syria, to bring in arms, troops, fighters? Is that true or false, in your opinion?
It could well be. There is a lot of smuggling of arms from Lebanon to Syria. There's a lot of smuggling of arms from Iraq to Syria. And the longer this conflict festers, the more smuggling there's going to be, the more radicalized the fighters are going to be, and the more outsiders are going to intervene in this conflict. And so it is better for Syria and Lebanon and the region that this conflict cease.
Okay, Robert, what do you think about that? How much outside influence is there fueling the conflict in Syria when we see Lebanon as a staging ground?
Look, I've been right up on the edge of the Syrian border in the north, and all Lebanese people living there, some of whom, of course, are Alawites, some of whom are Sunni Muslims, almost all of them told me that at night men do pass across the border in both directions. One family
Robert, I'm going to have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and I'll come back to you after that short break. After our short break, we'll continue our discussion on Lebanon. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about the violence spreading throughout the Middle East. Robert, right before we went to the break, you were telling me how you know people in northern Lebanon that said there are men that come through the night, okay? I mean, who are these people here? Because there's a wide range of opinions of who they are. Tunisians, people from Libya, jihadists from Saudi Arabia. I mean, you live there, I don't.
I think that we've got to cut out the mysterious, dark, evil foreign fighters from this narrative. It's what the Americans used all the time in Iraq, and I don't think Lebanon deserves that. There are men crossing that border who are Lebanese, and some of whom are Syrian. One family said to me, when we see them in the darkness, we say, God bless you, and take care. Clearly, weapons are going across. The Lebanese army found a truckload of weapons 2.5 months ago on the main coast road north of Beirut. Oddly enough, the UN, which patrols the coast of Lebanon with a warship to prevent Hezbollah getting weapons, didn't spot those weapons, which were apparently going to be used against the Assad regime. However, you can take conspiracy theories rather too far in Lebanon and believe everything that everybody tells you, so you will end up by believing absolutely nothing.
Okay, Typhoon, but there's no doubt that there's outside hands, and I mean, people do, there are Western powers that definitely want to see Assad go, and they've already said it, it's time for him to go. I mean, Lebanon is a perfect conduit to go into, to use subterfuge in Syria. Now, my point is that if you use Lebanon too much in that way, you could destroy already a fragile country.
That is true. So the point is, it is clear that these outside forces, mainly NATO, has already been involved in fueling the civil war in Syria from the get-go. I mean, based on certain WikiLeaks documents, I am originally from Turkey. The role of the Turkish government in fueling the violence in Syria by funding, providing arms and support to these so-called opposition groups that have been behind most of the violence in Syria itself has been documented. In fact, when the Turkish official in fact, when the Turkish official was in that document challenged by the fact that how will the civil war be be perpetrated when there is a lot of popular support for the Assad government. He said that is the Turkish responsibility. It will be a lot of blood, but that is our obligation to the Sunni population.
So, that's a very interesting accusation. Muraf, go ahead. In Washington, D.C., you want to react to that? This is crosstalk after all. Go ahead.
One, the conflict is not fueled by the opposition. It is a brutal regime that wants to hang on to power. If we are going to talk about the intervention of outside forces, and one that is not done in the dark of the night, as Robert tells us, let us look at what is happening in broad daylight, and that is the shipment of Russian arms through the port of Tartus to the Assad regime for him to continue killing an unarmed civilian revolution.
If you like it or not, it's not illegal. It's not illegal. There's no UN.
It's not illegal, but
there's no UN Security Council resolution against that. If you don't like it, you don't have to like it, but it's not illegal.
Oh, I hate it. I don't like it at all. It might not be illegal, but it's totally
there are plenty of people. Opposition is being given arms by the West.
A dictatorial regime that is fighting a civilian population.
Robert, go ahead, and you want to jump in?
Look, most of the reports coming out of Syria is
go ahead, Robert. Go ahead, Robert. Robert in Beirut, please.
I was going to say the word Libya there at the moment. I think the Russians are still very, very angry.
Exactly.
At the fact that NATO effectively took over Libya, and I think that that port is the only Mediterranean warm water port they've got left to them, and they want to keep it. And I suspect that it's more militarily important to Putin to keep that port than we realise. And when it comes to tough politics, remember, this is a Russian government that smashed up Chechnya. It's not going to have second thoughts.
Well, Russia wasn't going to let its own country fall apart. It's very different, Robert, when you look at Russia's territorial integrity and when you look at Libya. But I agree with you on Libya.
Look, we're talking now, excuse me a second, we're talking here about a Middle East that's been chopped up by other powers.
Well, Russia is not chopping up the Middle East.
It Russia.
It
seems to me that you're putting the Syrian point of view.
Well, Russia is not chopping up the Middle East. If anything else, it is trying to support international law. Typhoon, go ahead. I didn't expect this to happen. Typhoon, go ahead.
If anybody is trying to chop up Middle East, it is the imperialist-backed governments and NATO that is trying to reshape the existing independent states, taking the opportunity of the Arab Spring as a jumping point. And with the Syria case, when we talk about the Annan peace plan, it's being absolutely clear that it's just a stepping stone for validating, setting the pretext for military intervention by the NATO powers. How is it a just plan when one side, the so-called opposition, is funded and provided arms and behind most of the violence, and the Syrian government has to defend its sovereignty, and it is becoming obviously clear that this peace plan is nothing but an R2P, the responsibility to protect style NATO intervention, as has happened in Libya.
Okay, but let's stay with Lebanon here. How is this going to keep unfolding for Lebanon? Because if we can see more pressure on Assad to be removed by certain powers in the world, and that's the West and some Gulf countries here, I mean, is Lebanon going to be the staging ground? And that staging ground, in fact, will it destroy the country? It's very fragile, as I mentioned earlier in the program.
Look,
let me go to Washington. Let me go to Washington first. Go ahead.
Okay.
The spillover has happened. It's going to continue, it's going to increase. The more Assad feels vulnerable, the more he's going to use Lebanon again in order to deter foreign powers from moving his regime. And if you allow me, Peter, just a few seconds to say this, I want to go back to that slugfest we had. It's not because Russia is angry at what happened in Libya that this should be taken out against the Syrian people. And it's not because Russia wants the Syrian port of Tartus that it should be taken out against the Syrian people. You are all talking about outside intervention in NATO and chopping up the region. What you are forgetting is that the Syrian uprising is against a dictatorial family that has lost its legitimacy. And that is the bottom line, and we need to be on the side of democracy and freedom rather than on the side of a bloody family.
I think everybody would agree with that. I mean, it's just that why do you think the opposition being funded by outside powers is democratic? You know, that's my big problem with this. Robert, you wanted to jump in there? Go right ahead.
Well, I was going to go back to your question on Lebanon. You haven't brought up the Hezbollah, as you said you would.
Well, I wanted to. Go ahead.
Lebanon is always... Let me finish, first of all.
Please.
Lebanon is always going through the greatest crisis since the last greatest crisis. And various powers have been trying to destroy Lebanon for 100 years. And oddly enough, even after a 15-year civil war between 1975 and 1990, didn't manage it. I'll tell you one thing. I may be wrong on this, but I hope I'm not. I don't think Lebanese people today want another war.
Right.
At the time of the civil war, there were various cracks in the social structure of this country which could be opened up. But, you know, during that war, many Lebanese children were sent away to be educated in Rome, Berlin, London, New York, and they've come back and they've said no to sectarianism. And one of the things you do notice among the younger population here is they're not interested in being sectarian. Maybe that is certainly an interest among various groups inside Syria. I would just make one more little historical point. When the French took over the mandate for Syria and then Lebanon, they created a frontier force in Syria called Troupes Spéciales, special troops, and they were mostly made up, chosen by the French, of Alawites, and that's how that minority came to be allied originally with an outside power called France.
Mm-hmm. Typhoon, if I can go to you, Hezbollah was brought up here, and I think it's very important too, because this has also been a group that has been targeted by the Western powers primarily as an enemy, a terrorist organization, etc., etc. This seems to be an interesting opportunity for them to get rid of Assad and Hezbollah simultaneously, and I hope Robert is right. I mean, they don't destroy Lebanon in the process.
Well, so even though Hezbollah is portrayed by the Western
they go to
media
Pittsburgh here, Pittsburgh first.
Even though Hezbollah has been portrayed, continues to be portrayed by the Western media as just a puppet organization supported by Iran and Syria, that is actually not true. Hezbollah has a deep popular support in Lebanon with a lot of social services, hospitals and schools, and it has actually huge popularity, especially with the recent 2006 Israeli aggression and their defeat, mostly by thanks to the Hezbollah resistance. So for the NATO and supporting governments, this is a very good opportunity to get rid of this organization or that has strong ties to its public base.
Munafi, if I go back to you in Washington, again, the law of unintended consequences. How is things playing out with Syria, the unintended consequence for Lebanon here? Because when I look at all of these interventions in the past, they never work out the way you plan. Never.
I quite agree with Robert. The Lebanese are truly exhausted from their long civil war and have really very, very little appetite for a civil war. And therefore you have the dissociation policy of Mr. Najib Mikati, the Prime Minister. But I think that what is happening in the region is far stronger than this. Again, as Robert mentioned earlier, there are families that straddle the border. There are economic interests, and most of Lebanon's economy really is to a large extent, or to some extent at least, dependent upon Syria. So there are many links that tie Syria to Lebanon, and again, anything that happens to Syria or that happens in Syria is bound to impact on Lebanon. So despite the exhaustion of the Lebanese, despite the disassociation policy, I fear, again, that the conflict is spilling over into Lebanon. Now, Hezbollah, you mentioned Hezbollah.
I'm sorry, gentlemen, we've run out of time here, and let's all keep our fingers crossed for Lebanon. Many thanks to my guests today in Beirut, Pittsburgh, and in Washington. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.